everyone. Welcome to our E-DLD summer webinar. It's really great to be here, and we're recording this, so you might be watching this on YouTube later. But I'd love to introduce you to two fantastic colleagues. We've got Dr. Lucy Hughes and Dr. Robert Wells joining us. Lucy Hughes is from Morehouse Research and Training School and also from University of Reading. And Robert is joining us from Curtin University, particularly the Enable group. I'm just going to let Kylie in, who's another one of our early career researchers. So we're hosting as E-DLD today. I should have introduced myself. I'm Jenny Gibson. I'm one of the co-chairs of E-DLD, and we've got a few of the E-DLD team with us today. So we are going to have a talk focused on research priorities for the DLD communities in Australia and in the UK. So it'll be really interesting to hear what's similar and what's different and how that's being approached across those different countries. So if Robert, you'd like to go ahead and share your screen, we're going to have a talk. It's going to be about 30 to 40 minutes long, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So over to you, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us to talk about DLD research priorities across Australia and the UK. My name is Robert Wells, and I'd like to start off by acknowledging that I am joining you today from Whadjuk Noongar Budja here in Boorloo, Perth, in Western Australia. I'm part of a research group, the Language and Literacy and Young People Research Group, which is based at Curtin University, mainly at our Bentley campus here in WA. I'd like to pay our respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which Curtin University's Perth campuses are located, and on which I'm joining you from today. I'd like to extend that respect out to First Nations people all around the world, including those who may be watching today. We've got a broad agenda here, but we're going to flip between me talking about Australia and Lucy talking about the UK in a general sense. We're going to talk about DLD and for the purpose of the research outcomes and our shared insights from looking across both projects. Now, I've made a sort of brief version of what is DLD, and I'm assuming that those watching this will have some context and understanding for DLD when joining or watching an E-DLD talk. But developmental language disorder is a neurodevelopmental condition that affects approximately 7.6% of children, equating to about 2 children in every classroom of around 30 students, which is a stat that you may hear in connection with DLD. DLD is characterised by persistent difficulties in learning, using and understanding language. These challenges are not attributable to other biomedical conditions such as autism spectrum disorder or intellectual disability. DLD is a lifelong condition that can significantly impact a person's ability to communicate effectively, which in turn may impact their academic performance, social interactions, and emotional well-being. Despite its prevalence, DLD remains under-recognised and often misunderstood, which contributes to gaps in support and intervention, and as we'll talk about today, occasionally also research. Raising awareness about DLD is crucial to ensure that if individuals receive appropriate support and that their needs are considered in educational settings, clinical settings, and through a variety of settings throughout their life. DLD has far-reaching implications for individuals as well as their families. Children with DLD are at risk of a range of adverse outcomes, including internalising difficulties such as anxiety and emotional challenges, and externalising difficulties such as behavioural problems. These challenges can affect academic success, social relationships, and overall mental health. Families can often face significant stress as they navigate the complexities of supporting life with a child with DLD, including challenges around advocating for appropriate services and managing the emotional toll placed on the family. The lack of awareness and understanding among professionals within the school system and more broadly beyond education exacerbates these difficulties. Some families report feeling isolated and unsupported, and it's important that we take a systematic approach to address these difficulties and challenges within our community. You can see here that we're very passionate about DLD, and we really want to underscore the importance of addressing needs and challenges for people who have DLD and their families. And while I've spoken about children here a number of times, it's important to remember that DLD is lifelong, and that a number of the things I've spoken about, we perhaps have better evidence to talk to around children, but that doesn't mean that they're limited to, or that we're only talking about children today. And now I believe I'm handing over to Lucy. So bear with me while I stop sharing my screen. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Robert. So thank you, Robert, for providing that context. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about a project or a research priority setting partnership that we set up here in the UK in order to identify the most important questions for DLD future research. So I'll tell you a little bit about just the background and history of our project and how it came about. I'll tell you about the sort of methods and techniques that we used in order to develop questions from across the DLD community here in the UK. And then how we actually managed to prioritize our top 10 DLD questions. And I'll reveal those to you at the end. So thinking about the current research landscape, both in the UK and indeed internationally, we have really quite a large body now of emerging, robust but somewhat small-scale studies which tend to investigate the effectiveness of specific language interventions. So, for example, as Jenny said, I work at the Morehouse Research and Training Institute, part of Morehouse School and College, and here we've developed a system called shape coding, and there have been a number of studies carried out both here and also actually in Australia, looking at the effectiveness of shape coding in specialist school settings. Elsewhere, there are other programs that have been investigated, mostly focusing on vocabulary and grammatical interventions. But these studies tend to focus mainly on expressive language. There are fewer but emerging studies on how to support comprehension. There is strong evidence, including RCTs and meta-analyses, that's randomized control trials, I should say, which look at the effectiveness of parent-child interaction therapy for preschoolers. And there's also strong evidence for targeted speech and language programs, so those delivered, for example, by teaching assistants in schools and nurseries, most robustly demonstrated by the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, or the NELI. But what we see both here in the UK and internationally is that there is still quite limited research carried out with adolescents and with adults with DLD. There's also a real lack of studies focusing on bilingual or multilingual populations. And there's some early work beginning to develop looking at the overlap between DLD and other co-occurring conditions, including ADHD and also mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression. But what we know is that there are lots of uncertainties remaining, and a study carried out by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, which is our professional body here in the UK, really showed that clinicians or speech and language therapists felt that these evidence uncertainties were beginning to affect the delivery of their care. People weren't sure what were the correct interventions to offer and how to adapt them for different populations. So this really led the RCSLT, or the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, to launch an initiative looking at research priority setting. So we know that it's really important that robust research evidence is available to inform our clinical services and to make sure that these are evidence-based. But we as researchers are very aware that both time and research funding is always limited, and therefore it's really crucial that careful consideration is given to ensure that the limited resources that we have for research go to support research that is the most urgently required and the most meaningful to people who will actually benefit from that research, so people living with DLD. So some time ago, the RCSLT set up 5 different priority setting partnerships. And one of the areas that they focused on was developmental language disorder, or DLD. And it's important to note that here in the UK, the sort of gold standard of research priority setting is set out by something called the James Lind Alliance. And they've produced an approach with guidelines and a framework to try to consult with people with lived experience as well as frontline clinicians to identify priorities for research. But we felt that some of the methods and techniques that the JLA use and advise upon needed to be adapted somewhat to support the full participation of people with communication needs, and specifically with DLD. So some time ago now, before lockdown, the RCSLT launched phase 1 of their priority setting partnership for DLD, and that allowed us to identify a set of broad research priority areas for DLD and wider language disorder. And those areas focused on developing effective interventions with outcomes that were meaningful to the people that they were designed to support. Another focus was on developing our understanding of DLD in older children and adults, and also working on understanding and support for children and young people with DLD amongst education professionals. So those were the sort of broad areas that were identified from phase 1 of the priority setting partnership. But feedback that the RCSLT received from funders and also researchers was that while it was helpful to have these priority areas, really, first of all, it would be preferable to involve the James Lind Alliance directly in the priority setting partnership, and also that we needed to develop specific research questions that were co-produced or co-developed with the DLD community. And so this is where I became involved in the project just over 3 years ago now, in phase 2, which we called DLD questions. And this was all about co-producing research questions for DLD in the UK by consulting with members of the DLD community. So we started by setting up a steering group, and it's important to say that there were actually 2 adults with DLD who were involved from the beginning in our steering group. So one of those was Sophie Franks, who you'll hear from later in our conversation. There was another adult with DLD who prefers for their name and picture not to be shared, but it's just important to say that both of the adults said they would not have wanted to be the only person with DLD in a room or in meetings with other people that didn't have DLD. So you can see we also had Amit Kulkarni from the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, Rachel Sievers, who's an expert in working with adults with DLD, Claire Hoyle, who's a parent of a child with DLD and also works for the Aphasic Communication Charity. And then we had Dr. Susan Ebbels and Professor Courtney Norbury, both very accomplished clinical researchers and speech and language therapists themselves. So together we devised a process of methods and techniques to really support the participation of as many people as possible from within the DLD community. And I'm going to just talk you briefly through those stages today. So first of all, we had a very open online survey in which we basically just asked people, what are your top questions that you want us to find out about in relation to DLD? And from that, we had 119 respondents, most of whom, it has to be said, were speech and language therapists, because this was an RCSLT survey. But we did manage to speak to 11 people with DLD, as well as parents, teachers, and other professionals, including occupational therapists, teaching assistants, and other education staff. And together, this group suggested 559 questions about DLD. We were very aware that not everyone with DLD would be able to participate in our survey, although we tried to make it as accessible as possible. So alongside that, we developed something called a talking mat. Now, a talking mat is a visual communication and thinking system that allows people to indicate visually their views and preferences. So the RCSLT generously funded the development of this resource and also trained 24 speech and language therapists to use our talking mat with children and adults with DLD on their caseload. And we had 40 people altogether who took part, aged between 8 and 55 years, so quite a good spread of ages. And very briefly, from the talking mats phase of the project, children and adults with DLD identified that their top priorities were ways to help with talking, so expressive language, and also ways that teachers could help. Interestingly, children in particular were not so keen on having research on how to help at home, saying that they felt actually quite well supported at home, and also that they could actually do tasks that were less language based when they were at home, like playing with toys and Lego. They also weren't so keen on working with other children for support about DLD. They said, by and large, they preferred not to talk to their friends about having DLD, which in itself was quite interesting. So having gathered all that data from stage 1 of our project, we then asked a team of senior researchers, including Jenny, who's here today, to review all of these questions and suggestions from the public, and also to have a look at the existing evidence to find out if any of these questions had already been answered by research. And following this, the researchers drafted an initial list of questions. At this point, it's important to say that we basically grouped the suggested questions into 4 different areas, and these areas map onto something called the DLD vision. And now the DLD vision is a sort of mission statement here in the UK, which emphasises that people with DLD want to be diagnosed early, to be able to access the right intervention and support, for schools and workplaces to understand their needs, and also to be independent. So all of the questions that we were given were kind of sorted into these different areas. And then the researchers combined together, there were lots of sort of overlapping questions, and produced a draft list of 34 questions. Importantly, those questions were then checked by our steering group to ensure that they were as DLD friendly and accessible as possible. So that involved sometimes shortening the questions, having some sort of bullet points underneath to explain key terms, and also kind of bolding keywords. We also produced some images for each question to help people understand and process the questions. So having got our longer list of 34 questions, what we then did was to set up 4 project groups or focus groups, each involving at least 2 people with DLD, parents and clinicians as well. So each of the groups had about 8 people. We did lots of work prior to meeting online in our project groups to help familiarise people with the questions and the process of prioritising these. So each of the 4 project groups, this was our independence project group, worked together to identify 5 top questions in their area. So at the end of that stage, we had 4 lots of 5 top questions, so a top 20 in total. And these questions covered as I said before, diagnosis, intervention and support, schools and workplaces, and independence. This is how we sort of funneled down our questions through the different phases, coming to the final phase where we identified our top 10 questions. And this was done via a face-to-face workshop, which we held at the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists in London. The workshop was planned and co-delivered with consultants from the James Lind Alliance, which I mentioned earlier. And we had 16 participants, including 6 adults with DLD, 4 parents, teachers, an educational psychologist, speech and language therapists, and a charity representative. And you can see there how people are sorting the questions using a sort of traffic light system in order to finally arrive at our top 10. So without further ado, I shall reveal the results of our priority setting partnership. So it was rather exciting on the day when we found we actually had a tie for the top DLD question. So in equal first place, we had, how can we make it easy for people with DLD to get a diagnosis, and how can we best support them before, during, and after a diagnosis? So people thought it was really important to have their needs identified as early as possible, either as a child or a young person or as an adult, whenever they chose to seek that diagnosis. But people said, well, there's not so much point having a diagnosis if we can't access the right support. So in equal first place, we had a question around what training do education staff need so that they can help people with DLD to learn and have a better time in schools, colleges, and universities. And you'll notice that that very much spans the lifespan, and that was a theme that came up quite a lot throughout our priorities. So elsewhere in the top 5, you can see that top question again talks about how schools can prepare children to grow into adults who can find good jobs, live healthy and happy lives. So these kind of longer term meaningful outcomes. And also linking back to the first stage, we had the first phase of our project, we had what are the best DLD interventions that lead to good and important outcomes that last, and who can best deliver that intervention. Those were originally 2 separate questions, but our groups decided to combine them because they didn't want either of those elements to be lost. Elsewhere in the top 10, I'll just pick out 2 questions, number 7 and number 8. How can people with DLD be helped to get and keep jobs? And what's it like for people with DLD to get support from the disability and social care system? And you can see that both of those questions really highlight the involvement and priorities of adults with DLD. And this is in contrast to quite a lot of previous projects that haven't had such representation from adults. So that was really good to see those priorities coming through. I don't have time to talk about the top 20, but if you're interested in looking at those, there's a QR code there, or you can look on the RCSLT's website and search DLD research priorities. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Robert. You should be able to share now.
Thank you, Lucy. And I will be speaking to you about the DLD Voices research work that was focused on setting a research agenda for DLD research in Australia. Often on publications and in presentations, you'll see either my name or Dr. Liz Hill's name attached to this work. But much like when Lucy was speaking about their larger team, we have a team around us who make this work happen. Part of this team is the DLD Voices Consumer Advisory Group, or CAG, who are people with lived experience of DLD, who work with us to design and analyse the data that has come out of this work. Nikki and Nat, who are pictured here, are members of that group who contributed to the creation of this presentation and also the associated manuscript for this Australian work, which I'll speak to a bit later. We're incredibly grateful for the input of all consumer advisory group members, including those that are not pictured here. The manuscript for this work, for the Australian work, is currently under review, and so hopefully that will be available soonish. Throughout the presentation or towards the end, I'll share a QR code which will direct you to a preprint of that work. Very briefly, I wanted to orient everyone to why we conducted this work. We feel that research plays a key role in the community around helping to not only identify and give attention to different topics and diagnoses, but also to help shape best practice through making available different types of evidence in order to shape evidence-based practice. Ultimately, Liz and I created this project when we discussed what our next step in DLD research would be, and we decided that it should not be us who decide what research is conducted, which led us into this idea of speaking to and consulting with the DLD community. We felt that though our choice as researchers to investigate a particular area or not, through our choice to investigate a particular area or not, we shape the evidence that is available, and ultimately it's the consumers, the people with DLD and their families and supporters who need to find merit and value in that work. So it's important we lead by example and design with the end user in mind. The DLD Voices project was initiated to address this gap by adopting a bottom-up approach. We started with input from the DLD community, including individuals with DLD, their families and supporters, with the project aiming to ensure that research priorities were grounded in the real-world experiences of people with DLD. We hope that this methodology allows the DLD community to shape the research agenda and lead to outcomes that are relevant, practical and impactful within day-to-day life. The primary aim of the DLD Voices project was to identify and prioritise the research needs of consumers with lived experience of DLD, their families and their supporters. The goal was to set a future research agenda in Australia that reflects the perspectives and priorities of the Australian DLD community that has a meaningful impact for the DLD community. We started off by developing research priorities. We used a Q method, which I actually won't be getting into too much in today's presentation, but suffice to say we created a Q set. 25 participants took part in 6 workshops through the Perth metro area. These participants were anonymous and each identified as being connected to DLD in some way. And provided a base set of research priorities. This activity was then recreated online and distributed nationally, with a further 57 anonymous participants taking part and contributing to that set. The Consumer Advisory Group worked with researchers to synthesise all of these research priorities that had been gathered into one list. A bit similar to how Lucy has spoken about consolidating priorities previously, the challenge here was not to lose priorities, but also not to group priorities together in a way that made them so broad that they were unclear. We've spoken informally before, and that's a shared challenge of this type of work. This resulted in a Q set of 31 research priorities, which we sorted in the next phase. We sorted the research priorities, again, using a Q method, and this is referred to as a Q sort. This phase included 35 participants from across Australia, representing the key stakeholder groups. We sought out to include people with DLD, as well as family members and supporters, and professionals who were trained to support people with DLD. I'm well aware that the subcategory numbers don't add up to 35 here, and within this methodology, that's totally fine, as people can identify as being a member of more than one subgroup. The image that you can see here is an empty factor array into which participants would sort each of the 31 statements, allocating each statement a rating of +3, most important, to -3, least important. Recruitment was conducted through community networks, social media, and professional organisations. Most participants chose to complete this activity via the online software. Participants were also given the opportunity to complete the activity in hard copy, which they could post back to us, or over the phone or via a Teams meeting. Our consumer advisory group supported with interpreting what the results could mean. Following a Q method, participants were first clustered by looking at the way in which they sorted priorities, which are known as factors. Analysis then considers the specific sortings of these factors and the demographics of these participants onto each factor. Qualitative analysis is then used to conduct qualitative analysis is then conducted by the researchers. That sentence makes a bit more sense. To identify and present the potential reasoning for these sortings by these participants. These are known as viewpoints. There's a bit of method there, but suffice to say, we got down to 2 viewpoints that I'll speak to now. The first of the 2 viewpoints that I'll speak to is the environmental supports and enabling participation viewpoint. This viewpoint prioritised research that supports day-to-day life and builds a supportive network around those impacted by DLD. Key areas of focus included improving educational inclusion, enhancing social support systems, and increasing the availability of evidence-based interventions. Note here that it's not about increasing the number of evidence-based interventions, but the availability of evidence-based interventions. Interestingly, all participants in this viewpoint identified that they were a family member or supporter of someone with DLD. This viewpoint emphasises the importance of understanding the broader impact of DLD on family dynamics and on mental health. This highlights the need for practical, accessible solutions that address real challenges faced by individuals with DLD and their families. The second viewpoint is the building the evidence-based viewpoint. Research prioritised by this viewpoint focused on building professional competencies, developing appropriate accommodations, and improving the identification of DLD. This viewpoint is underscored by the need for robust evidence to guide clinical practice and educational strategies. Participants in this viewpoint also emphasise the importance of linking DLD to related diagnoses to better understand its complexity and improve diagnostic accuracy. Interestingly, most participants in this viewpoint were professionals who supported people with DLD. Their perspective reflects a commitment to enhancing service delivery through informed and evidence-based approaches. Despite differences in emphasis, I do want to underscore that there were many similarities across both viewpoints. These included the need for evidence-based interventions, stronger support systems, and impactful research with tangible outcomes for daily life for those who have DLD. The convergence of viewpoints highlights areas of agreement that can act as a focal point for future research and policy development. That is to say, future research doesn't necessarily have to address one viewpoint or the other, but may be able to be designed in a way that addresses both viewpoints. It's also important to note that some research priorities identified in this work would be able to be done in quite a short time span in research that we might say that's like a year or 2. Some would include projects that may take multiple steps. Some may take decades to establish, let alone conduct. Some of these research priorities, on the other hand, have already been completed or are underway. And so some of our work needs to focus on improving strategies for research translation and going back to work that has done and highlighting the evidence base that is already existing. In a broad sense, this work shows us that the future of DLD research in Australia should take a neurodiverse affirming approach, prioritise lived experience involvement in future research projects, and focus on research translation, as I said, for existing studies that are already part of our evidence base, and thinking about research translation strategy for future research projects. We've just got a few slides now to talk about the connection between UK and Australian DLD research priorities. I created this initial slide, and Lucy and I spoke about it as thinking about the connection between the different priorities, and my goal here was just to do a bit of an analysis and based on the content of the statements to put points of connection between the UK priorities, which you can see the 10 blue around the top and bottom, and the 30 or so Australian priorities, which you can see we use letters rather than numbers, you can see in the centre. I started out thinking this was going to be a really simple graphic that would be really clear illustration, and from there I would be able to talk about things that were strong connection and things that were not. Interestingly, all priorities have at least one point of connection between Australia and the UK, and many have several. Also, interestingly, generally items rated more highly in the UK priority setting had a higher number of connections to the Australian items. While this is based on my interpretation only, where previous work we've discussed today is around team-based research and peer-reviewed research and published research, it is interesting to see that there's such a high level of connection. My intention was also to map the whole 20, but you can see here how 10 became quite messy quite quickly. And so I decided to stop there. I'm going to hand over to Lucy now to talk about next steps.
Thank you, Robert. Oh, it's gone back to the beginning. That's annoying. Sorry. Here we are. So both in the UK and Australia, our priority setting projects and partnerships have identified the top questions to be tackled first and foremost in our research. So the next step, of course, is to seek for that research to be funded and carried out, and then ultimately for the results of those new studies to be shared and implemented into everyday speech and language therapy or pathology practice. We believe this can only happen with a real system-wide collaborative push from across the whole DLD community. And as Robert has shared, those kind of interactions between the priorities that have been identified, we believe create real opportunities for international collaboration to hopefully put DLD on that worldwide map. For any researchers who are here today, we'd really like you to have a look at these priorities and use them to guide or inform your research strategy and plans. When you're writing funding bids, please do take these into account. It might actually strengthen your proposal to make reference to the DLD research priorities. And for everybody, we'd really encourage and ask you to share information about the priorities. There'll be more links to information at the end. Please get involved in research, either as a participant or a facilitator, and help us share our new findings, our new knowledge nationally and internationally, so that this can really be embedded in clinical services to make sure they're tailored and aligned to people's needs and priorities. Before we end, I want to give the final word to Sophie Franks. She's an adult with DLD who was part of our steering group on the DLD Questions project, and she really sums up our hopes for the work that we've done together.
I hope it makes a big difference, because something needs to be done. It's like it needs to be pushed, and just fingers crossed that it will spread more awareness and get more help for people with DLD.
Absolutely, and I think that's what really guided all of us throughout the process. I'd like to acknowledge the many people, including Jenny, who's here today, for their help and support advice, participation throughout the project. It really was a huge team effort. Robert, do you want to say thank you to people that helped you too?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our participants from all across Australia for helping to giving time to make these priorities come into life and to have them grounded really in their own experiences, which is really, really lovely. I'd like to thank our consumer advisory group and acknowledge the significant work that they've done in partnership with the researchers on this team to set the direction and help understand and make sense of the results. And I'd like to thank the Curtin School of Allied Health and the Stan Perrin Charitable Foundation for supporting this work. As I said before, I'm part of the Language and Literacy in Young People Research Group at Curtin University. We have a mailing list which I've put there. If you do wish to be involved in research, be a partner in research, hear about outcomes, or be involved in our public awareness efforts, you can join our mailing list there. If you'd not like to join our mailing list, but you would like to see our work, you can head to our website, which has got the URL listed there as well.
Thank you. And we have put here some QR codes, which you can photograph, scan, and they'll take you to our websites with more information about the projects. And in Robert's case, there's a preprint article which summarises the results of the Australian study. But if you have any questions, we would absolutely love to hear from you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy and Robert. It's been fascinating to hear about the projects and congratulations on a great talk.